So good evening, everyone. Thank you for making time to come. I'm sure by this time people were asking, why are we not organizing the event at a much bigger venue? I didn't know Afua was that popular, even though I knew she was very popular. I didn't know it was a very, 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 very popular. I can't imagine tickets going up at about 12:19 a.m. and by 6 a.m. the next day, tickets had run out. It's like, what? Wow. Okay, so we are very sorry we couldn't have it at a much bigger venue. Thanks to COVID, Oxford had decided to be more complex and complicated, as if they weren't already. So you forgive us. And we promise we'll bring Afua back sometime, because some of you have read the book and you're absolutely fascinated. You want to have, much bigger conversation than, just having a small room in an exclusive All Souls College. Afua, thank you very much. Even though I feel very odd to be calling you Afua. You and I know how I call you. Oh. But thank you so much for making time all the way from London, Wimbledon, as you make it famous in your book, all the way down to Oxford, just to have a talk with us and discuss your book with us. We're all looking forward to a fascinating discussion. Nana Fuyata Fusia Fuyata Eim. Sorry for trying to rechristen you. We thank you so much for doing us the honor. Who else could talk to Afua? I wouldn't be able to. Maybe there are other people in the room who will be able to, but I cannot discuss a book because I'm underqualified. So thank you for doing us the honor. And thanks everyone for signing up. Again, typical, another apology. We're supposed to have books here on sale so that, Afua's signature will be on display. But unfortunately, Blackwell's disappointed us at the last minute, so they couldn't come and do a book sale. And that's why we don't have any books on display for you guys to buy. But I'm sure when we bring Afua again, she'll be able to sign all your books when you would have already gotten copies. So thank you very much. Nana, you can take over now. Thank you for the honor, Danas.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming.
Okay, so I know that Afua needs no introduction here because everybody knows the important and amazing work that she does on behalf of all of us in this country and outside as well. I got to know Afua first through the Guardian articles that she did, and then got to know her in person, and now have got to know her through her book. Yeah, the book covers so much. It covers politics and culture and music and the past and travel and slavery and hair and just so many topics. But I feel like at the core of the book is this question of belonging and your search, which I think so many of us, especially those that kind of grew up in between cultures, can resonate with so much. And you go back to Ghana, you go to Senegal, then you go back to Ghana looking for this space in which you belong. And so I guess my first question to you is, did you find it?
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be speaking to you, by the way. I so look up to this woman. You're so incredible and I really admire your work. So it's a real joy to be with you. And thank you for your very kind words about my work. So I think it is a very common experience for those of us who are third culture people, who are part of diasporas, this obviously feeling your otherness in the place that you grew up or are educated, but then going back to the country of your heritage and realizing you're not the same as somebody from your country who hasn't left either, and this desire to find a place where you can just be, where you don't have to explain yourself, where people aren't questioning you about your legitimacy to claim that identity. In my case, I grew up in a very white environment in Wimbledon. It was very middle class. I think like many Ghanaians of a certain generation and a certain class background, my mother was focused in such a laser way on educational and social opportunity, and also being Ghanaian herself, didn't have the experience of growing up as someone who's minoritized. So her priority was just good education, safe and healthy environment in which to raise children. I'm sure whiteness wasn't even a concept in her own mind, let alone a term she would use. It was just part and parcel of having a certain class privilege, which she wanted to pass on to us. And my father's white and British, so neither of my parents actually were really equipped to understand what it's like to be minoritized from birth. And so that was something I learned for myself just through my lived experience of being constantly othered, being perceived as different, constantly having to explain my name or my hair texture or the kinds of food we ate at home. And that giving me a very strong sense of my blackness and my blackness being very specifically connected to Ghana. So it seemed very logical to me growing up that if I could just go to Ghana and live there, that would solve all my problems of belonging, obviously. So it was a genuine shock, and it's hard to really overstate how shocking it was the first time I went to Ghana and saying to my mum, "Oh, what does Obrini mean?" Because it just didn't occur to me that Ghanaians would see me as anything other than a lost child coming home. And it was a really painful and in some ways quite traumatic realization. There was so much joy in experiencing Ghana, but that was something that was really difficult to get over, having been the black girl in my life, the Ghanaian girl, to go to Ghana and realize I really wasn't seen by Ghanaians as black or Ghanaian at all. Even, I mean, to this day, when you rock up at the airport and they look at my passport, my name is Afua Caroline Owusu Hirsch. And they look at it and they go, "Caroline." And I go, "No, Afua. Are you sure?" And I'm like, "Yes, I'm sure. You know what it means." I'm like, "I know what my name means." And they just the kind of disconnect between the idea that that could really be my name. It's such a kind of metaphor for the experience. What I learned on this journey of, and also because of my Pan-Africanist ideals, it was really important to me to live in other African countries. Before I lived in Senegal, I've worked in so many countries on the continent. And I think what I've realized, well, really two things, that Ghanaians don't owe me a perception that I belong there, and I think that in a way, ironically, that is a kind of entitlement. This idea that you should be accepted, you should fit in. Once I started to really understand the Ghanaian context, of course, it makes sense that I'm being perceived with the proximity to whiteness, the privilege of living in a country like Britain. So I stopped centering myself, really started to understand the Ghanaian perspective, which then led me to see how even my kind of demand to be accepted was part of this kind of entitlement that comes with the colonial legacy, really. And the second thing is I learned on a more personal level that identity is really not a destination. It's not a place that if you can just go there. And subsequently, I have found places where people look like me. I go to Jamaica, I could pass for Jamaican if I keep my mouth shut. Even some North African countries, I could kind of blend in, but it's not about just looking like everybody else. There is no perfect destination. It's a process. It's a process of interrogating your heritage, your ancestry, your purpose, your mission, the communities you feel a mission to help and uplift and work alongside within your life. And that's the important process. And it's not really about the place that you find. So I've learned to love and embrace the journey, but that it took me kind of exhausting the possibility of finding a place that I felt I could just fit into to really get to the point where I realized that's actually not the point at all.
Wow. It sounds almost like a hero's journey. You kind of go through, you look for something that was inside of you all the time.
Yeah. And then realize that the thing you were looking for is not the thing.
Yeah. It's funny. I you talk about your daughter at the end of the book and how when you're somewhere and somebody asks her, "Where are you guys from?" and you say, "I'm British," and she said, "No, we're Ghanaian." And it feels like it's a kind of almost like a mirror of your daughter and your mother in that kind of sense of belongingness that they both have. And there's another, you use the phrase at some point of kind of closing the circle. I think when you go back to Aburi, you're kind of closing the circle with your grandmother.
Yeah.
And it feels like there's these kind of consecutive circles that keep being closed.
Yeah, and I believe in that on quite a kind of karmic level. And it's not just an African experience. You know, for example, there's a book by the human rights lawyer Philippe Sands, East West Street, which if you haven't read it, I highly recommend. It's an incredible piece of work about his Jewish heritage. And he went into what's actually quite an established theory in psychodynamics about how when grandparents have been through some kind of flight or trauma, they often raise their children in a way they don't pass on their heritage or their story or their connection to their heritage, because they want their children to escape the pain that they've had. And so their children learn that it's taboo and they kind of don't really interrogate that. But they then go on to raise children who inherit this void where that continuity of their identity should be, and also have the safe distance to begin asking the questions. It's quite an established phenomenon in Holocaust survivors or children of refugees, for example. And it's not the children, it's the grandchildren. And that resonated with me on such a deep level, because my grandmother was trying to get away from the things that really forced her and my grandfather out of Ghana. And her reaction was to raise her children to be as British as possible. And you know that thing that we do, speak English, I don't want you to have an accent, so I'm not teaching you Tree, you know, which of course, like, is not rooted in any understanding of how multilingualism works, but it's an emotional response to the pressure to assimilate. And all of her children, my mum and all her siblings, all have white partners, all assimilated into middle-class Britishness, as much as you're allowed to do when you're Black, which is obviously limited. And it's my generation who are trying to get back to our Africanness, to our Blackness, who are now asking my grandmother, wait, hang on a minute, why didn't you take us back to the village? Why did you not connect us to the rest of the extended family? And you know, in my case, unwittingly holding her to account in the most, probably for her, annoying way by actually finding a partner who's from the village that she was trying to run away from. Totally ignorant. I mean, I couldn't have named Konkonru when I met him. I just met him and had this kind of really inexplicable attraction. And I think that's just a metaphor for what happens, that you find a way, you know the void in your own story, and you look for things that help to fill it, even if you can't articulate that that's what you're doing. And that's certainly the case in my story. And talking to other people with those stories of migration or diaspora, I found that it's actually quite a common thing.
Wow. I got this sense from your book, even though it wasn't written in any kind of mystical way, I got this sense from your book that all of the different layers that you describe, from your father's side of the family to your mother's side of the family, to even the people that you speak to, from you, and also you working at The Voice as a teenager, it all kind of, I mean, obviously kind of in our culture, there's a sense of your path having been written before you're even born, even though you might not know, but you kind of are somehow being led in it. And I got this sense of, when I was reading your book, of all these different elements, that there is a sense of, even though you feel lost, that everything that you're experiencing is kind of unfolding so that you can write this book, and so that you can be this voice that you are. Yeah, I just no one's ever commented on that before, but it really resonates with me. And I do think I believe in destiny, and I believe that in a way the suffering I experienced, because I can speak about my identity crisis in quite an academic way, but the reality was, as a young person, I was really troubled. I was really lost. And it was on a knife edge as to whether I was going to find a positive way of harnessing that, or whether I was going to self-destruct. And I wouldn't be able to do the work I do now had I not really gone all out in that crisis, I suppose. And of course, at the time, that's not why I was doing it. I was just being true to my crisis. But I do feel that every part of my struggle and my journey, in a way, has come together to create something that I hope adds to the collective work that we do as Black people in this country. And it is such a privilege to feel like you're able to draw on your strengths, your weaknesses, your successes, your failures, in a way that
create something that's more than the sum of its parts. And that's what I strive to do with my life experience. And I'm really blessed to be a storyteller, because it's such a unique gift to be able to tell stories and reach people and feel like your darkest times are now helping someone else. And so when young people come up to me, especially young people in this country who've grown up in quite white environments, and they say, I really thought I was the only person who knows how this feels, and now this has given me a language to navigate my own experience, that means everything to me. For just one person to say that in a way, it makes it all worthwhile. So it's been a real privilege. And when I wrote this book, it's hard to overstate how scary it was, because these are things that I hadn't even necessarily said to my parents. These are conversations that just we hadn't had. So when I talk about how difficult it can be to have these conversations with the generation who raised you, I mean it in a very personal way. It's like a closed space. And it was easy. So in fact, Sam has this joke, which is actually partly true, because I had this book event in Wimbledon. I did Wimbledon Book Fest, and it was literally at the end of my road, and I couldn't believe how popular it was. It kind of sold out, there were queues, and as I was going in the queue, I saw former teachers, my parents' friends. It was crazy. And then I kind of sat on the stage and I looked at these people and I was like, you are all the people who it was so difficult to have this conversation with, that I had to go into crisis, come out the other side, write a book, sell the book, sell out tickets to a book festival, sit on the stage, and then tell you the thing that I just wish I could have told you when I was growing up. And Sam always says, it was easier for you to write a book, have it become a bestseller, do book events, and put your parents in the front row so they could hear you on stage speaking about it, than it was for you to just go in and say, like, Mum and Dad, real talk. And it's kind of joking, but it's kind of true. That was my way of kind of like pushing the door open. And I guess as a writer, that's the language I speak. But when I wrote the book, I did not know that was going to happen. And I was scared that the people close to me might cancel me, might be so defensive and so afraid and feel so threatened by me blowing open this hidden world of how I perceive things through the lens of my Blackness, which I'd never communicated in real life because it just felt too taboo to do so. I thought it might be like catastrophic for my career, for my social life, for my relationships and my family, because I hadn't heard someone like me talking like that before. And the opposite happened. It was a really profound experience that I think people can engage with material that's challenging for them if they feel like it's honest, and they feel like it's authentic. And so people from backgrounds I never thought I would reach said they felt touched by my book because it just seemed true, it seemed honest. And I learned a lot from that. I think it's helped me on a journey where I've become more and more fearless, actually, about saying things that once I would have been terrified to say.
Wow, I think, the idea of truth really resonates. I think when Azamati was saying as well, how you weave the personal and the kind of extra personal and political, and you bring it all together in a way that comes like, there was, I think, you brought me to tears, I think, more than once when I was reading about the girl who was orphaned and she couldn't, she first went into a white family who had no connection to her identity, and then she went into a Black family that beat her, and like that feeling of just being, there was so much kind of pathos and so much pain in so many of the stories, and it really was, there's gratitude as well for you being able to give voice to these stories that are not seen. But I do think of you as someone courageous, very courageous, because I've seen you, as a pundit on TV, and I've seen all these, you sitting there as the only Black person on this stage, and all of these people coming for you, and you're standing your ground. And I look at you and I'm like, how can she do? Like, I would be, I'd either get angry or I'd walk out. I don't know quite how you managed to kind of keep that center of staying in your truth while people are, like it's that, like that Rudyard Kipling poem where you'll stay, while people, I can't remember the poem, but while all about you are losing their heads and blaming it on you, there is that sense of the equanimity. So it's interesting that you say that you had the courage, you have to have the courage in the person.
I think I should say I feel quite conflicted about those TV appearances, because I believed at the time of doing them that it was really important to have a voice like mine in that space. And, you know, I would get feedback, people would be like, thank you, so it means so much to me, because that's what I experienced at work, for example, you know, in the canteen. And this is now giving me courage to actually confront these people who kind of try and gang up on me and gaslight me. On the other hand, I felt that I was being complicit in legitimizing a space that is wrong, that, you know, it's supposed to be a debate. And then you have four white people who are basically defensive and feel threatened by your lived perspective and experience, who are essentially ganging up on you to shut down your reality. And it's not fair. It's not a conversation. And you know, these debates, like the one I used to do on Sky News, for example, the pledge, the premise was, for example, you have kind of two people on the left, two people on the right, one kind of centrist person. It kind of works on Brexit, you know, but when it comes to race, it's fascinating. They never agree on anything. When it comes to race, they would subconsciously gang up to oppose me because they felt so threatened by the idea that there was this whole narrative and perspective that they did not have access to, and that they had been complicit in something unjust. And I used to think that it was wrong to put anyone in the position of having to defend their lived experience as a Black person. You know, it's not like arguing about the border in the Irish Sea. It's like having to argue that your humanity is equal, that you actually deserve a space at the table, that you are allowed to have a voice. And that is dehumanizing and also part of the problem rather than part of the solution. So I felt like if these conversations are happening, it's important to have someone who can do justice to all of the people who do not have you guys' lens. On the other hand, I felt like I was participating in something that was set up to be unfair. And ultimately, that was the conclusion I came to, because I kept doing it while I believed that I was educating them and I was persuading people. But it came to the point where I realized that actually they have no interest in being educated. This is entertainment for them. And, you know, we come out of these conversations, which were actually really difficult for me in the sense that it was painful, because I was reliving my experiences growing up, where you're now having to persuade people that your identity exists. And, you know, we'd have these debates and they were being racist and they were being all the things that they are. And we'd come off and they'd be like, that was great, wasn't it? It was a great debate. But then it's just like another bit of banter. And I would come off feeling like I literally wanted to murder someone. So eventually I kind of reassessed that. And now I'm really vocal about critiquing the ways in which the media tried to profit out of people who dehumanize Blackness, because I think it's a real trend. And it did work for them. It really drove views, it drove ratings, it became a really popular show. And it all rested on my labor in defending my humanity, which by proxy to me was Black people defending our humanity in white spaces, which is a premise that I now fully reject.
Okay, speaking about white spaces and having to, you know, the emotional labor of being in white spaces and having to represent, maybe be great to hear you actually read something from your book, especially for those who might not have read it.
Yes, I actually struggled with what to read, because I wanted to read a kind of Oxford themed part, but then I thought, of all the people, you guys probably know that bit already. I might be preaching to the choir. It's kind of like, yeah, so I'm not going to do the Oxford, I'm going to just read a bit from the beginning, which is Oxford related. On a Friday evening in October 2004, with the nights drawing in and the layers piling up over summer clothes, I was sitting cross-legged in the living room of my friend Miranda's house in East London. I'd recently returned from living in Senegal, one of the last frontiers of Africa before it stabs into the Atlantic Ocean to the west and melts into the Sahara Desert in the north. 2 years earlier, I'd barely had time to say goodbye to these university friends. I'd given myself a few days to recover from the exhaustion of my final exams, packed 2 large suitcases, then boarded an Air France flight, 21 years old, impatient to begin the journey into my new African identity. It was a journey that had been years in the planning. The friends gathered round on this autumn night had treated my return much as they had treated my departure, curious but unsurprised. I came bearing stories of unpredictable work in countries that most British people have hardly heard of: Chad, Burkina Faso, Sao Tome, of trying to hold meetings with government ministers in languages I could barely speak, of only just surviving cerebral malaria, of smuggling suitcases of cash into Liberia. My friends, deep in the hustle of London's graduate job market, pointed out how fortunate I was to be able to decorate my CV with this kind of experience, that had never been the reason for going. I hadn't left Britain to become an expat with a competitive advantage in the job scrum. I had left Britain to leave being British. I believed that relocating my future to one or more of Africa's many nations would solve the problems of belonging that had nibbled away at me, a mixed race girl growing up in Britain for as long as I could remember. I had not meant to come back, not after 2 years, not ever. I had meant to settle in West Africa for good and take up my place in the world as a proud African in places where I thought I would fit in. Exactly the opposite had happened. Living in Senegal, I had discovered, to my endless confusion, how British I was. Returning to London meant the relief of familiarity, of home, but the painful reminder that home was a place that had surveyed me as alien, questioned me about my background, and expected me to provide explanations. Very little, it seemed, had changed. Evenings like this in the little terrace house that marked the beginning of a steep staircase of Victorian houses descending down to the River Lee and the bleak London marshland beyond were different. These friends and I, a group of Black, mixed race and other misfit Oxford graduates, sitting in a loose circle on the carpet, were bonded by the fact that none of us had ever really fitted in. So we would congregate there, feasting on vegan food, painfully aware of the cliches and contradictions that we embodied, trying to work out the point of it all. I'd longed for this companionship while I'd been away, and the rhythms of our London lives, the quirkiness of our homes and our clothes and our seasons, the cynicism and sarcasm of our humour. Now I was back in the midst of these traditions and drinking them in like warm tea. I was in love with a man I'd met not long before, Sam, who lived just a mile away from Miranda in Tottenham, a part of London he always described as the hood. This environment had shaped him into a person unlike any I had met before. And having returned to it from a northern university where he'd spent 3 years getting a law degree, he now clerked at a solicitor's firm during the day, saving up money before starting the vocational course to become a barrister. He spent each evening after work at the athletics track near White Hart Lane, where he trained as a sprinter. Lumps of lactic acid layering themselves onto his thighs hour upon hour. Unlike any other 24-year-old I knew, Sam had his own car, a source of independence which he had spent years working. And he was always on the move late at night, plugging away at the personal development books he credited with sparing him the same fates as his friends. It never ceased to shock me how many of the people he grew up with were in jail or in and out of mental institutions or stuck in minimum wage jobs. And in his community, he seemed to know everyone. That night, Sam was visiting a school friend who lived on a nearby council estate further up Miranda's Road, a sprawl of decaying social housing at the top of the hill. Neither of us could have known that this was the last time Sam would visit. Just a few weeks later, his friend was dead, caught up in the crossfire from the turf war. These weren't innocent times. His friends were already starting to get slowly drawn into the drug trade, the one industry that provided many local jobs. But for a few hours that evening, it was like the old days, before Sam had gone away to university and left his friends behind, just hanging out with the boys on the block, catching up. Since he was so close by, Sam offered to pick me up from Miranda's house and drive me home to Wimbledon, where I lived, around 17 miles across town. Just before midnight, he rang the doorbell. The scene had already played itself out in my mind. I was excited about introducing my friends to this man they had heard so much about. I pictured him coming in, joining our little circle, sharing some tofu cheesecake. That, however, is not how it went down. Miranda opened the door. Sam said hello to her cautiously as he stepped through that front door and into the room with the big bay window, the cluttered piano. Once inside, he stopped dead, as if in shock, and stared. He shifted from foot to foot, mumbling hello, gazing around in bewilderment, taking it all in. Sam, so confident, so uneasily fazed, was quiet and perplexed. In all his life, he told me later, he had never seen a scene like this. People talking so earnestly, almost conspiratorially in low, hushed voices, even eating the way we were eating, an array of strange plant-based foods being passed around on little plates. 13 years later, we still talk about that day. You lot, just sitting there with your herbal tea all round in a circle, nah. Sam shakes his head. That blew my mind. And I mean, I thought I'd seen it all. What was so strange about it, I asked. Don't understand, he shakes his head again. This area's hood, you know. People getting shot in the area, man them on the hustle. And you lot were sitting there all oblivious, all huddled around. in Wimbledon, yeah, fine. But in my area, and you still behave in the same way, I would never, in all these years growing up around here, have known that that scene could even exist in my area. There was something else that bothered Sam at the time. He had his own preconceptions about my group of friends. He knew we'd been to Oxford, that many of us were privately educated, some at elite boarding schools. Now we had our degrees in the bag. We represented everything that he and his friends had never had access to, a kind of uniform privilege that, as far as he was concerned, meant that success for us was guaranteed with as much certainty as failure was for most of the people around him. Listen, in my brain, you lot went to Oxford. You're supposed to be the creme de la creme. You're supposed to be blitzing this life. And there you were sitting around so tentative, like, so unsure of yourselves. Trust me, a man like me had the opportunities you all had. There'd be no stopping me. We'd be up in this country making some serious money. We'd be running things instead of sitting around all quiet. Conversations with Sam still go like this.
Wow. So yeah, there's so much in that story that the idea of class, of exclusion, inclusion, of place, of hierarchy, all of these things are kind of in that first album. Yeah. And yeah, it makes me think of you quoted Toni Morrison at some point where you said that, I can't remember the exact quote, but it's something like racism is a distraction because you're constantly having to prove that you have a history, you're constantly having to prove. And it reminded me of another place in the book where you said, you were talking about being the good immigrant, and that the notion of being a good immigrant actually doesn't really work. And it made me think of this kind of eternal striving that I'm sure we all have to some extent or other, that we're always trying to be. And yet, you also talk about Serena Williams, who literally has reached the apex of brilliance and perfection, and yet still she's constantly having to fight what is the kind of the kind of burden of racism.
Yeah, that was a really informative experience for me because I grew up in Wimbledon. There were no Black people in Wimbledon, and the Black people that were there were very invisible and always shrinking themselves to try and assimilate, which is the kind of dominant British mentality that if you are going to be here, we're going to tolerate you. And it is important to say that tolerance is still the mainstream concept that Britain runs for how it deals with immigrant communities. Like, as if that's literally the word, we're tolerant, like that's supposed to be a good thing. Like, in spite of the fact that you're here and it's really undesirable, we're going to put up with it. And so the Black people that did exist, and I include myself and my family, that the message was, just shrink yourself to fit what's already here. Don't draw attention to your difference. Don't provoke or disrupt the status quo. And the status quo is whiteness, right? So you learn in a very subtle way from an early age, and you get rewarded for that. My friends would say to me, don't worry, you're great. We don't even see you as Black. That is how they, also children, had subconsciously internalized the narrative that Blackness is bad, it's highly undesirable, but if you just do the right thing, behave like us, just don't talk about that Black stuff, don't draw any necessary attention to it, we might be willing to accept you as almost like us. And I had enough content in my Ghanaian heritage to reject that, for which I'm so grateful. I had a counter to it. I had a family that had a completely different cultural story that I loved, that I felt I belonged to, that acted as a counter. And I always think about that when I think about people who are born without that, people who are like 4th or 5th generation who don't actually have a reference to their Blackness other than the racial reference of the British lens that sees it as a problem, and how difficult it is to construct any kind of self-love if that's your foundation. So I struggle, but I'm super grateful that I had the Ghanaian story. But here come the Williams girls, and they literally, so in Wimbledon, there aren't really any hotels. So people don't realize, but during the tennis, the tennis stars rent out houses, and it's a big market for local people. And if you have a big house, you get one of the big stars. But then Serena and Venus were quite new. So they were both with their dad renting a house on my road. So literally was walking to school one day and I see these two black girls with white beads in their hair. And they weren't like trying to relax their hair and like look white. They had white beads in their braids. I was like, damn. Then they pop up on court. And they don't just pop up on court, they absolutely slay, like they demolished the competition. They were phenomenal. So for me, this was like a life-changing experience because here were these black girls who were better than everyone else whilst being unapologetically black. And I was like, I didn't know you could do that. I'd never seen an example of that before. So it resonated with me in a very profound way. And they were so undeniably better than everyone else. And then I listened to the narrative around them, like these girls shouldn't even be allowed to compete. It's not fair. They're monsters. They're beasts. The language that was being used was like the most unreconstructed slavery era racist rhetoric. And it was coming from like the BBC commentator, The Times. And it was a really useful moment for me because I learned from that the counter to the message I'd been given, which was, if you just keep your head down, do well, and prove that you're good enough, you will be accepted. And what I saw was this racism thing is no joke. Like wherever you go, no matter what your accomplishments, they will hit you with the racism. And in a way that was very liberating because it taught me, don't try and assimilate. They will never see you as one of them. It doesn't matter what your accomplishments are. And that was kind of permission to let go of the idea that I could ever be seen as the same as everyone else, which allowed me then to tap into the reality that I didn't want to be. I didn't want to assimilate into whiteness. But it's very hard to have the confidence to reject that when every social message is pressuring you that that's what you do, that's what you get rewarded for. If you're good and you assimilate into whiteness, people reward you. You get promoted at work, you get OBEs, you become part of the establishment. And and I've learned this firsthand, if you reject assimilating into whiteness, and if you actually critique the pressure to assimilate into whiteness, and if you are unapologetically black and you take up space in your blackness, you get penalized for it, literally. So that's why I suppose I really believe in building communities around this unapologetic blackness, because you can't do it on your own. And generations have learned that lesson. But the Williams were a big influence because it was just an unparalleled experience for me. And it was like 0 to 100, like no unapologetic black people to the most unapologetic, literally best athletes in the world ever. And they were my age as well. They were black girls my age. So it was pretty deep.
Wow. Within the book, you also have like your personal, you weave in your personal stories with these much bigger historical narratives. You talk about Satya, I don't know how to say it, Satya Hartman, and you talk about this idea of Britain's secrets. And I really kind of, that phrase really resonated with me as well, this idea of this Britain as it represents itself to the world, and then all of the things under the surface. And then you bring in, at the end, you bring in Brexit as well, and this kind of nostalgia for empire as it's imagined to be, but without the kind of truth and the honesty of slavery and of, brutalization and all of these things. And it made me, even what you wrote about abolition, I didn't know, like I'm quite, I delve into these things, and I learned so much about, the history of abolition in this country through your book. And I was wondering, and I don't, what's the time, actually, please? I want to open it up at some point. Yeah. And so in a minute, I want to open it up, but on this kind of realm, I think, but to really think about how do you propose that, because I think one of the undercurrents of your book is that if we are honest about these things, if we do bring them to the surface, we can create a better society, a more transparent and more honest society. And so one of the things I want to throw to you in a minute, but ask you first, how do we do that?
Well, the frustration I have, I was saying this to you earlier, with the state of Britain, is that In fact, let me just tell you a story. After George Floyd was murdered, I was talking to this veteran civil rights activist, this like old black British man who's been doing this work literally his whole life, like half a century. And he said to me, you know, the great thing about this moment is that in Britain, you know, all my life have been at -10 and now we're getting to 0. And I was like, wow, damn, you know what, that's true. And yeah, -10 to 0 is progress, but is it progress you really feel very celebratory about? It's like, this is where we're at. We are having to strive to get to 0. 0 being the baseline where you can actually start building differently. But all this time we've been engaged in having to fight for the right to own the narrative that we were at -10, that we are in a nation that was in such profound denial that you can't even begin to do the work because you're having to dismantle all these systems of erasure, denial, deceit. And that's hard because it's not really the work, it's the prerequisite to the work. And I think that, you know, nostalgia is actually, in the roots of nostalgia are, it was seen as an illness. It was actually illness that was treated by doctors. That is the origins of nostalgia. In the 17th century, these Swiss mercenaries were being recruited to fight European wars from the Alps, and they got really, really sick. And it was believed that it was like this longing for this like imagined alpine utopia that they came from, and they would romanticize it in their misery. And like they were underpaid and underfed and malnourished and exploited. So no wonder they were sick. But they kind of projected that onto their longing for their homeland, and they imagined this homeland as this literal like alpine utopia. And I'm sure it was very nice, but you know, they obviously romanticized it. And that was a sickness that was treated by doctors. And I say that because, in my opinion, the narrative that Britain has created for itself is a sickness. It is a sickness that is creating seriously toxic results. And when I wrote this book, it was actually before the Brexit vote. And my whole thesis was that Britain is so dishonest about Britishness, about the history and the content and the context of Britishness, that it's incapable of creating a modern identity that includes its best talent, that harnesses its resources, that can compete in the world with other countries that have a more honest narrative about who they are and are able to include the people that will make it a great nation. And so Britain is in the throes of this self-destruction. And it's so interesting to me that, in a way, I think Britain is so addicted to white supremacy that it would rather self-destruct economically and politically than confront its white supremacy. And Brexit is literally the best example you could hope for. This is going to damage your economic interests, reduce your status on the world stage, and yet you still choose it because it helps you to feed your addiction to narratives of white supremacy, that you are a nation of indigenous white people who occupy a moral and civilizational superiority in the world. And that hasn't always been Britain's identity. That was very deliberately created during the colonial era. And it's, you know, if I can take a step back from my own personal feelings about this, it's actually quite a fascinating time we're living through. It's a case study into how bad for white people white supremacy is, in my opinion.
It's funny because, you know, I work with museums and restitution and all of this stuff. And I kind of feel like a lot of the time, museums, I feel like, are in this state of crisis where they were built on imperialism. And most of the people that run museums are actually good people, but they don't know where to even begin to undo all of the harm that was caused by museums. And a lot of time, for example, I'm brought in and they're looking at me, you know, saying, what do we do? And I'm just like, not my problem. It's not my problem. You created this. You
built it.
You dig yourselves out. And then they're all like, decolonization this, and I'm like, not my problem. And I feel like that's kind of one of the moments that we're going through where there's all these, you know, decolonization is being thrown about left, right, and center. And they're looking to us as translators, as educators, to hold their hand, because we've been doing this work all along. And so we're kind of fluent in this language, and they need us. But I'm just like, no, I've done the work. I don't need to hold your hand.
And the work is not work that needs to be done by you
Exactly.
or anyone in this room.
Yeah.
The work is the work that people who self-identify as white and part of the white British story need to do. And they're completely used to expecting our labour to solve their problems. That's part of the reason we're in this place. So like, it's kind of logical to me that you can't solve a problem by loading disproportionate labour onto Black people, the doing of which is what created the problem in the first place, you know. But it's so interesting. A friend of mine, this is such a ridiculous example, again, after George Floyd's murder, my sister has a lot of white friends. And after George Floyd's murder, one of them, who she went to university with, called her up and said, she's like, why did you never talk to me about racism? When we were at university, you never talked to me about it, never explained it to me. And now I feel like I've got no tools to navigate this. I'm so unfit because you never, like I was friends with you all this time, you never told me anything, you never educated me. It's really unfair. And I was just like, this is so deep. This person's response to this moment of awakening about the extent of racism is to demand unpaid labor from my sister that she must draw on her trauma to educate this person. And the failure to do so is a wrong that has now been done. I was just like, wow.
Wow.
Wow. Imagine, I just try to imagine going through the world with that level of entitlement. But, you know, I think that is often the case. And, you know, I would say in my book is not really about people who self-identify as racist or people who are attached to white supremacy. My book is about well-intentioned racism. It's about the people who think they're part of the solution whilst being complicit in the problem because they haven't done the work. And the work is work that you have to do. It's self-education. We know we're not getting taught this at school or at university. And therefore, only through a process of self-education can you actually equip yourself to understand this. And I think that there's work for all of us to do, but I think especially white people need to do this work because they have done less thinking about it than we have. So, you know, I grew up around people who would be mortified if you ever described them as racist, but they are busy enjoying the privileges of being white in a system that privileges whiteness. And I can't help them with that. That's work they have to do. And I think that is a really important message. So, sorry, just come back to your original question, like, what do we need to do? This book for me was part of the project that not just me, but many others have been doing about naming the problem, developing a language for it. You know, I really believe that because in Britain, we haven't been having a high quality conversation about any of this, we haven't even got a good language for it. You know, you get the language you deserve as a society. And when you don't think about something, you don't have a public discourse about it, you don't have a good language for it. So it's on that level, developing a language, creating spaces in which to have these conversations, even introducing people to the concept that this is work they need to do. That was what my book, I think, was part of a moment where, in a way, we had to advocate and educate people that this needs to be done. That needs to be done so we can then start the next step, which is actually what does a society which isn't built on white supremacy look like, and how do you get there? Which is a much bigger conversation, and you know, can feel a little abstract at times, I have to say. But that's the real work, and not just here. I mean, you know, I really think a lot about Ghana and other former British colonies, where you come from here, and I suppose I occupy a very privileged life here in the sense that I tend to move around Black people and other people of colour who are immersed in this conversation. And I think you do get a false sense of consciousness because you're surrounded by other conscious people who are interested in the work. And then sometimes I go to Ghana and I'm like, shit, this is still the empire. You know, Prince Charles comes and everybody drops everything to run to meet Prince Charles. And I'm like, I'm so confused right now. It's, you know, and it's not, you know, if you want to meet Prince Charles, I'm not judging, but it's the lack of interrogation about what that says about us psychologically. You know, the ways that people behave towards white people in Ghana is just so troubling. The number of Ghanaians I know from Oxford who went back to Ghana, rolled out a white friend from Oxford to be the face of their business, knowing that it would just throw the doors open. And this friend has nothing to do with the business, but this friend is like the face and name of the business, because they figured that having a white person from Oxford be the face of their business would take it to a different level. And they've invariably turned out to be right. I'm not saying it's the only way you can build a successful business in Ireland, but the fact that you would do that and it would work, I think says a lot. So, you know, I think that we're all victims of empire. It was, it wasn't, their empire wasn't sustained by physical violence. It was sustained by mental conditioning, by convincing us of our own inferiority, by persuading us that aspiring to whiteness or proximity to Britishness was the best thing that could happen. And that is a powerful mindset that is easily passed on intergenerationally. That's the work that I think we all have to do, whether we're here, whether we're there. And that's the conversation that needs to be had. And I feel like it's accelerating now. And I do feel really positive about that. And, for me, I saw more change in the last year than probably my whole lifetime put together. I struggle with the fact that it took the violent murder of a Black man live stream to open that space more, but it has opened more. But that's the work, really. And it starts with seeing and identifying the problem.
You're talking about what happened last year, but just a few days ago, when I speak about us globally had a verdict that kind of counteracted the Kyle Rittenhouse verdict. That was just like, we're actually not moving forward. I mean, I don't be careful how I say this. One of the things I think that's unpopular is, a lot of people in the last year were like, I want racism to be done by the time my daughter's at university or whatever. And I do too. But I think that you have to locate your work in this intergenerational struggle that we have inherited a level of activism and discourse because of previous generations. And we will pass on a higher level of activism and consciousness because of our work and so on. And I personally think that being realistic about the lifespan of this problem and the generations it takes to dismantle it is useful, because then you don't lose heart when you see that by the end of 2022 we haven't dismantled white supremacy. You realize that it doesn't work like that. It's a mission. It's a lifelong mission, and it's an intergenerational mission. So my goal is to help and the next generation begin further along than we started, and so on. I personally, like, some people don't want to hear that, but I think that's realistic, and I think it's so important to engage with the previous generations to continue their work, to pick up where they left off, not try and reinvent the wheel. And that's one of the legacies of white supremacy, right? That each generation feels like it's doing this for the first time, because the work of previous generations is erased, or it's made obscure, or it's rendered invisible. And so we never get anywhere. We start from the beginning, we get to the end. The next generation comes, starts from the beginning, and gets to the end. And one of the parts of the work is to make that legacy visible so that we can properly inherit it and further it. And to see this in its proper scope, which is a multi-generational project. Well, I think you've done an incredible job, and are keeping to do and are still doing an incredible job. But I want to open it up because there's a lot of people here, and I'm sure lots of people have questions, and also to maybe co-think about some of the questions that Afua's book opens up. This idea of what you just asked, how do we create a society that is not based on white supremacy? So welcome, Akwaaba, into the conversation.
Thank you, Shai. There is also a beautiful irony about having this conversation here at All Souls, because I did lay it heavily into the say. So I always enjoy these juxtapositions, and we've got like our white dudes on the wall, mandatory in any Oxford setting. So it's always interesting to be in these spaces, and that's our reality, right? These are the spaces that we occupy, and it is what it is. I had an argument with a friend who just accepted an OBE, because I personally, I find it really painful when we accept OBEs.
Yeah,
but I don't judge people.
Yeah.
But I find it painful, and I feel like if I were to accept an OBE, which I personally wouldn't, I would do it with a heavy heart. Like, this is kind of painful to my ancestry and my inheritance, but I'm in the system and I have to play the game, and I get it. I get why for many people they feel like they need that. None of us can judge the choice. We all make compromises. I'm sure there are people who think that I am too close to the system to really be able to have a radical influence. Like, everybody navigates this in their own way. But this friend of mine was like, yay, not only am I in the palace, the queen in the palace, and the queen. And I was like, really? And this person's an anti-racism activist. So I was like, you know, one thing if you're like a charity person or maybe an artist, I mean, that's problematic, but like your whole thing is anti-racism. So, you know, so I personally, I like to kind of just acknowledge and see the problematic spaces that we have to occupy. And it's not to judge. I went to university here. I benefited from going to university here. It's furthered my ability to do this work. You know, I was able to access, I was able to go to the bar, I was able to write for the Guardian, I was able to get like a very mainstream publisher. So we're all in the system one way or another, but for me, it's like to see it and acknowledge it and to kind of sit with the problematic nature of how this all works. Sorry, I'm talking when you wanted to be asking questions.
Does anyone have questions or anything that they want to share in this space? You're too old.
Hello.
Hey.
Hi. I'm Kyria from Belize. And I wanted to ask, so you talk a bit about, I remember reading the part in the book where you said, you know, when you were younger, you're talking to your friends and they were like, we don't think of you as Black. And I wonder, and you mentioned that also just now, and I wonder how much of that processing, because I know like, as Black people, and if you grew up in like mixed communities, you're undoing the work. You're 13 and you're trying to figure out why the boys in your class don't like you back and things like that. So like, you're kind of doing the work from that age, whereas maybe 2020, lots of white people have started to think through these things. And I just wondered if you had any advice, I suppose, because you talk about this book being for, you know, the next generation, about healthy ways to sort of work through these things. And if those realizations still happen where you think, you know, 10 years you're thinking that was racist, you know, that comment was racist or that interaction was racist, and just ideas or thoughts you had about kind of healthy ways to work through these things.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, you know, I'm a mother and I have a 10-year-old daughter, and it's really hard because I'm very comfortable with the narrative that I'm part of, but when you have a small child, you really want to shelter them from the reality of white supremacy. You just want to protect them from it because it's so toxic and it's so violent for a Black child, especially a Black girl. But at the same time, I want to equip my daughter to see it and know it so that she has a way of navigating it, that where her integrity and her kind of joy in her Blackness is intact. And it's quite a hard balance, I think, to get that right. And the way I do it is really to kind of be guided by her. So because children see things, you know, children see things and children perceive things from such an early age, and to make sure that you can help guide how they process the perceptions. It's so much easier now because there is so much material. There's like child-centric material. There's so much mainstream material. You know, it's now like a theme in lots of children's books or children's TV, and that kind of makes it easier to have conversations. But the main way I do it is just by, you know, I think about Blackness in a way in this country where there are really two parts to it. One is the experience of racism, the problem of white supremacy, the inheritance of colonialism, all this pain and trauma that we often think about much earlier age than white people do because we don't have the luxury of ignoring it. But the other part is like joy, Black joy, or joy in our Blackness, the pride in our heritage, the celebratory aspects of our community and our cultures. And I think for children as well, that's, I guess I had the benefit of that without having a name for it. And that is so important. And I think often in Britain, because we're so beleaguered, and it comes back to the Toni Morrison quote, we're so beleaguered by the distraction of racism. We're constantly trying to prove that we're good enough. We're trying to prove that we can get a seat at the table. We're trying to prove that we're a good immigrant, all the things we have to prove all the time, that we don't really have any psychological space or opportunities to just center our joy. And that's a really, really important thing to me. And like being Black is not about fighting racism, obviously, right? That's what white people told us. It could be about once, you know, it's almost like the best thing that can happen to you is the racism stop and then you fight it. So I think, especially in Britain, and this is actually a disconnect, I think, with, like, for example, I find like in Ghana, for example, a lot of Ghanaians don't really get racism because they haven't, I suppose it feels like you haven't experienced it. Like, obviously, the whole economic reality of Ghana is a direct result of racism, but you're not coming up against white people who say racist things to you on a daily basis. And so then Ghanaians often say to me, why are you doing this? Stop making so much noise about it. You might upset white people, you know, and it's just like, I get why you would see it like that, but I don't even know what to say. So I think, you know, but then here we have the opposite problem, where we're so consumed by the problem of racism that we don't actually just be. And that's really important. So I try to create space to be. I try to create communities where we can be. We don't have to explode, we don't have to apologize, we don't have to fight. We can actually center our culture and our joy and our aesthetics and all the other things that are beautiful in life.
It's funny that you say about the difference between being here and in Ghana, because when I moved back to Ghana, I really felt like, and I think I've said this to you before, like this shield of protection that I didn't even know I was carrying when I lived here. Just like, it was so heavy. And when I got to Ghana and I was living there, it was just like, I don't have to live through this layer of blackness anymore. Like, it's not the first thing people see about me anymore. And yet, living in Ghana is a whole nother hustle. It's a whole nother struggle. And part of that struggle and that hustle is, it's another sense of having to prove yourself, not just within Ghana, but on the global scale. It's like, you know, I work in the arts, you know, it's like we have to lift our arts to be on an equal level, to be, you know, I know of the wealth of our art and how talented we are, but I'm constantly having to fight in order to show that to, not just to the outside world, but even to ourselves, because our arts were so denigrated back to ourselves that we're constantly looking for it on the outside. Going back to bringing you guys in, last time I was here, we spoke together about decolonizing the curriculum. And we spoke with, there was about 3 young people on the panel, and they were actively working towards decolonizing the curriculum.
That was one of those moments. I was like, oh, things are changing. It was unthinkable to me when I was here. I don't think anyone talked about decolonizing curriculum, let alone it's like a movement.
Yeah, they were very activists. And when you were talking in your book about making the secret Britain more visible, I was thinking as well, I mean, I don't know if anybody wants to chip in, but you know, being here at Oxford, where a lot of the agenda for the nation gets written, in that a lot of the future leaders of Britain are here. And I was just thinking, you know, are there ways in this space that the curriculum, that the ways that we learn, the ways of seeing and being can be opened up and expanded? And have any of you thought about that in your disciplines or your departments? Are there ways, and you know, how can we support you if there are ways?
I'd actually be really curious, because I'm obviously not here anymore, and I'm not in academia or in this country at the moment. From the outside, you kind of, it's self-selective what you hear. You hear activists who are talking about decolonizing, people who in the academy who are working on decolonizing reach out to people like me. But I have no idea, as a student here, are you experiencing a sense of the curriculum being decolonized? Like, is it now being mainstreamed into the discourse? I'd be so interested to know if anyone has a perspective on that. Because from the outside, sometimes you imagine that it's all been done now. You know, it's completely a decolonized canon. I have a feeling that's not the case, but it's not.
I think I'm in anthropology, and I think a lot of the language around decolonization has been used, especially last year. But in terms of practice, I'm not sure what the difference is, because I think I often found myself wondering what a Black Zambian woman is doing in an anthropology class, and I have no place here. And I think it was because I thought there was such a disconnect between who I was and who I am and what anthropology, at least as it was being presented to me, stood for. And I think that in itself speaks for the fact that there's still a huge gap.
And anthropology of all disciplines.
Yeah, I hadn't thought that through today.
No, well, I mean, it can't change unless we have people with different perspectives and value systems, but it must feel a bit like colonial ground zero, I imagine.
Yeah, a little different now because there are more people of color in my year than they were last year, and I think that in itself, that small, just seeing people like me thinking about whether it doesn't have to even be Blackness, but just seeing people like me thinking in the same space that I'm in makes a difference. So perhaps that's one move in the right direction.
Interesting.
Hi, I'm Sean. It's been wonderful hearing you both speak about, particularly about this idea of representation. I think one thing to speak about what Oxford's been doing, I think the past summer there was we're in the Oxford Foundry, which is like the innovation center or the entrepreneurship center here. And they ran a program for people of color to be represented in digital tech, where basically where the economy is going, to give them or give us, a place where we could meet high-profile mentors, be placed with top startups to kind of build the representation. I think one thing I'm curious to get your thoughts on is one mentor came in and he was speaking about the difference between London and not London. And he was talking about how it's like, digital firms or any firms, they say, oh, we hire at the national rate of, what immigrants make up of the UK population, which is whatever, less than 10%. But then if you go to London, it's massively more, but nobody uses that statistic. They use the national statistic, and so it brought out this dichotomy of London, not London, and what does that mean? And particularly when people are trying to find their space and where representation. I'm curious what your thoughts about that, about the representation in these new and growing spaces. And that was one of Oxford Foundry's way of doing it. I think it's, to be honest, a small start, but I think what was interesting was how hard and how long it took to even make that program happen here. It was really difficult.
Wow. I mean, the tech companies are really scary because in a way, this is a new industry. This is a new industry and it looks even worse than the old industries when it comes to representation of people of color, women even. Shocking. So anything that kind of diversifies those companies, and you look at it, it's not because we're not starting these companies, it's not because we don't have good ideas, it's because access to capital as a Black person in Britain is shocking. You can't fundraise, can't get investors, it's just really very structurally wrong. I really do have some thoughts about that. It reminds me of the media industry that I predominantly work in, that basically 90% of big media companies in Britain are based in London, and they all compare their levels of diversity to the national average. The average in London is close to 40%. So when they say we've got 5% people of colour and that's the national average, it's you should be measuring against your population pool, which is literally 40, soon to be 50%. So it's very cynical. Another thing that's happening in media, I think it's happening in other industries, is this pressure to diversify into the regions and the nations. So for example, BBC, Channel 4 have been forced as a condition of their funding to set up in Cardiff, in Glasgow, and in Belfast. And this is being championed as a great move for diversity. They are moving to places where there are no Black people. So conveniently, they've just shifted the focus away from race to now we've got more people from Belfast working in the company, which, don't get me wrong, I am totally intersectional when I think about race and class. But how can something be progress if you're deliberately choosing places where conveniently no people of colour or very few people of colour? It feels like a dangerous distraction from the very fundamental problem, which is that they have, and they've always done a better job telling stories about class, achieving social mobility through class. And when I say they've done a better job, they've done a poor job, but it's been vastly better than the job they've done on creating opportunities. And crucially, I think power for people of colour, because there's lots of interns, no one stays, nobody gets to a position where they control budgets or hiring or making strategic decisions. So, and I see that replicated in the legal profession and tech. But tech's really bad. It's really, really bad. And that is kind of disturbing, given it feels like a kind of clean slate to do things differently. So not. Yeah, thanks. That's interesting about Foundry.
Yeah. Sorry. No, please. Okay, I'm Emeka. I'm from Nigeria. So I just wanted to add to what Alaba said earlier about representation. So I did the energy systems course last year, which is supposed to be about transition of global energy systems from non-renewable to renewable fuels. And I think for like 95% of the time, we were basically studying British energy systems and European energy systems. I kept questioning my professors about it, but I think they lacked a credible answer to the question, because it was like within the pool of staff they had, within the resources they had, they found a challenge in finding resources on African energy transitions. And I think it also, just like you said, our fathers did something and then we couldn't take up from where they stopped. I listened to a famous Nigerian politician speak once about the African economy. He said he did an MBA in the US, and he was talking to his professor about why they didn't teach the African economy when he paid to learn about global economies. And the professor told him there's nothing like an African economy, because basically the African nations just copy the templates from Europe or from America. And then that's how it tends to keep, perpetuating. And also, just like in response to what you said about tech now, I read a very interesting article. And the person was talking about why we have not seen men like Dangote, for instance, come out to invest in tech startups like Flutterwaves or Kuda and all of that. Why we keep having to depend on British or American money when we still have some billionaires back home that can actually bankroll some of these projects. So I think all of this is leading to my question, which is like, based on your experience, because you've seen it here, you've seen it in Ghana, you've seen it in Senegal, what do you think is like the underlying problem? And also, do you think it's basically a Black people problem? Do you think the Asians also suffer the same thing? Do you think the other people who are colonized also suffer the same thing? And then, based on the problem, what do you think are the practical steps? Just like you did mention, these conversations have been going on for decades, but they don't seem to be making a lot of very impactful change compared to what we want to see. Like, we move from -10 to 0, but we want to be at 100, not at 0. So what are the things that we can actually start doing now to begin to change this narrative?
Yeah, so I think it's so useful to have a historical perspective, because, like this professor who you were listening to, he was saying, that African economies just copy Europe. The structures are so historic. So obviously we had a generation of African leaders who had a radical vision for African socialism, for renewable energy. Kwame Nkrumah created an Akosombo Dam in the 1950s and 60s. We had a generation who had a vision for transforming the economy, for having these big structural transitions into modern economies for African countries. They were all taken out one by one by Western imperialism. Every year new documents get declassified, that you see another one where it looked like a coup, but really the CIA backed it, or really MI5 backed it. And it's not a conspiracy theory, it's documented historical fact that any African leader with a radical vision to transition away from a resource extractive economic model that benefited former colonial powers was not allowed to see that vision through, was literally not allowed to stay in office. And that, when you look at obviously the role that Africa plays in the global economy, you can see why. Because if you allow African countries to transition into innovative, modern, disruptive economic hubs, then you take out the resource base that all of the big economies need. So that's not going to be allowed to happen anytime soon. And, I obviously can't come up with a solution to that, given this is like a centuries-old model, but at least to see it and understand it. And, it really frustrates me when people in Ghana or Nigeria say, oh, the problem with us Africans is we don't have any good ideas, or we don't know how to create anything, we don't know how to run it. This is what I mean by colonialism has been so successful. It's made us internalize these racist narratives and actually believe them about ourselves. That we actually believe that the reason these leaders failed was because they were too corrupt, or they didn't have good ideas, or they didn't know how to run a country. And of course there were human flaws, like there is in every leader, but it just conveniently omits the historic fact that these economies have not been allowed to transition. And it's really difficult to see how they could be allowed to transition as things currently stand. Look at the sovereign debt crisis in African countries. Like, there's always a new generation of methods in which we become embroiled in colonial patterns of resource extraction. So I think that seeing that and talking about it and taking that as our baseline would be a big step forward. Because again, it's another way we always go back to the beginning and like, oh, if we could just have better ideas, everything would be fine. we're not allowed to see through our better ideas as things currently stand. And also, you know, coming from a British perspective, Britain is getting away with, oh, we love our African partners, we invest loads in them. Britain currently invests in keeping that pattern that benefits Britain, and will continue to, because every nation operates in its self-interest, but it frustrates me when we just don't see it and kind of call a spade a spade. So, you know, that having been said, I think that what's so interesting about this moment is about how disruptive new tech is. Like cryptocurrencies, for example, which I know have like recently been banned in Nigeria because Nigerians have just been killing it with crypto. And that represents a real opportunity to subvert international financial institutions, to subvert traditional finance companies. And I think it's hard to see a future where the old ways of controlling economies will be allowed to continue. And so I think that's exciting, because we know what the old ways look like for us. Not to say, and it's also frustrating when people say, yeah, well, tech's coming, so everything's fine. You know, obviously, like look who's running tech companies, and look who's investing in them. But I do think it's a really disruptive moment, and that could be interesting. And I would love to see us get more strategic about it. I'd love to see African leaders get more strategic about to harness it if they're really serious about change. Because so far we're always like 10 steps behind, like on the back foot. We're still talking about creating bonds in Ghana. Wow. Anyway, yeah, so I hope that but yeah, it's interesting to hear about your experience.
There's 4 questions, so yeah, we'll go.
I'll be as brief as I can. My name is Rotimi Akincheta, a new member of staff, non-academic. Thank you so much for this. This is fantastic. It's making me feel this is a great decision that I actually decided to take up the job, which is great. And I hope we can do lots more of this. A couple of things. Your question, I'm so sorry I forgot your name, but you quoted Rudyard Kipling, the poet. It was If, I think, the poem, which is one of my favorites, mainly because I'm a man and a psychotherapist. And he quotes in there, if you can keep your head while all around you are losing yours. Now, my question is, how the hell are you not losing your mind, all that you've gone through? Because it's incredible all that you've had to put up with, not just in the media, but also with the continuation of, you know, what you consider, you know, important to your daughter, to your life, to the life of non-white people in this country. That's one thing. 2, we all know that Kwame Nkrumah would have probably had the same considerations. He put his head above the pulpit only to be attacked for his Pan-Africanist and socialist views, all which have made a significant difference. And you're doing in some ways exactly the same thing. Now, my second question really is that for Kwame Nkrumah and for those who were socialists at the time, they thought Pan-Africanism was the only answer to the issue of not just racism, but colonialism. We can't try to resolve colonialism without taking a Pan-Africanist view. That is that other like-minded people across the continent come together and think consciously about how they deal with this. My question to you is, why then, therefore, shouldn't we continue to give or think or have a Pan-Africanist perspective if we have to think that racism is to finally be destroyed? I don't think there's any way around it.
I'm 100% a Pan-Africanist, and not just the African continent, but the diaspora. And that was an important part of that generation of Pan-Africanist thinking, that you also find like-minded communities, leaders in the Caribbean and South America, in America, and this idea of global blackness being invested in a thriving and resurgent African continent. You can't think about ending racism unless the African continent is decolonized and thriving. Because if we don't have our own continent and resource base that we run, how can we command and leverage our rights anywhere else? You know, and you don't, I mean, I'm a former human rights lawyer, I believe in human rights, but the geopolitical reality is you cannot make demands if you're having to ask for them. You know, there's no example in history where people have been given something because other people are nice. You get it because you have something you can leverage to demand your rights, your respect, your affluence, your property. And so the Pan-Africanists, that those, you know, and there were so many generations of them, but I always go back to those visions, and they were audacious. They created entire new intellectual frameworks for thinking about this. And again, it frustrates me that we kind of don't engage with that. It's being discredited by design. So I couldn't have put it better. I completely agree with that. And I very proudly self-identify as Pan-Africanist. Your first question, how do I keep my head? I think that I, in a way, one of the kind of legacies of my childhood was that in a way I'm like uniquely skilled to deal with well-intentioned racist white people because I grew up with them. And I think that is one of the complicated things about the role I played in the media, is that I kind of had this guilt that I've so benefited from my proximity to whiteness, you know, and I enjoy this class privilege, this color privilege, because Britain is still such a colorist society. And as a light-skinned woman, you know that people perceive you as more proximate to whiteness and therefore kind of let you in the room. And I could only really reconcile those privileges if I was using them to try and attack the white supremacy that these people have. So it was a kind of burden of guilt that I was like, well, I'm the one that gets in the room because of all these privileges that are rooted in racism. So now I have to be using the space to challenge it. Otherwise, I'm just as bad as them. I'm just part of the problem. And I stand by that in the sense that I think it is so important as a Black person as well, or a mixed race person, to interrogate your own privilege. You know, I can't talk to white people about how they need to self-educate and become part of the solution and see their role in the problem if I'm not willing to do the same. And the consequence of that is that then you have to work out how to use your privilege and how you're using it for change rather than just enjoying it. But the flip side that's problematic is that then I think you can feel this burden that you have to be in these racist spaces doing this work, and it's not psychologically sustainable for anyone to do that beyond the point they can do it, and everyone has their own tolerance for it and their own appetite. And I kind of went in quite naively thinking, like, if I can just make the point well enough and in an articulate enough way that's grounded in enough research and historically agreed fact, then obviously they're going to learn. And, you know, I had to actually exhaust that before I worked out that that's not how this works. They are enjoying their racism. It's working for them. This isn't an accident. This is by design, you know, and I had to go through that process. And now I honestly don't think money could pay me to go and sit with Piers Morgan on TV. But at the time, I thought I was doing some kind of active service. So, you know, everybody has their role to play. Everyone has their journey. When I was up for it, I could do it. Now I literally could not do it because it would just feel like an act of self-harm, to be honest. So that's my journey.
You had a question?
So, as you've been saying, like your media appearances, like the media, and especially journalism, and like the institutions of Britain, they're all hostile and white supremacists. But you were saying about like creating language to kind of help get rid of that. But what spaces are there to do that? And if they're so hostile, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what we've been doing with our books, with our, you know, there are so many podcasts, people of color, Black women, hijabis, people like, there are so many communities where people are creating their own spaces and conversations and completely bypassing the traditional white gatekeepers. And that's where actually a lot of the innovation is happening, because you can't really be innovative in a hostile white space. You're just kind of working really, really hard just to stay afloat, you know, and I'm sure we can all relate to that feeling, like treading water just to get through a day. You can't actually do any beautiful strokes when you're literally treading water trying not to sink. So I read books by other young Black British authors, by other authors of color, and I'm learning stuff all the time. They are like taking this kind of unapologetic, taking up space idea to the next level, coming up with terms I didn't have. So I think that's what I love about this moment. In a way, we're like cutting them out and saying, I don't need the approval of the BBC because here's my like multi-million audience YouTube channel that people are watching because it's good. And, you know, that's how gatekeeping worked. It kind of distorted the market and persuaded us that there was no audience for our truth. And actually now, whether they get it or not, we know that we have an audience and we can be honest and people can relate to it. So I think that's really interesting, but I personally think the sooner you get away with the idea that those spaces where the change happens, the better. That doesn't mean you don't use those spaces. I probably wouldn't be able to do what I'm doing now if I hadn't gone through the establishment, the Guardian, Sky News, the Bar. All these places helped me, I guess, with my own perception of knowing that I could be in those spaces, so that then I could reject it as a matter of choice. Whereas if I hadn't been in there, I maybe would have this sense that maybe I wasn't good enough to get in. Now I realize it's not a meritocracy, so it's not about whether you're good enough. And also once you get in there, it's the same shit, different day, you know, whether it's the Times or the Telegraph or the Guardian, whether it's Channel 4 or the BBC or Sky, it's the same thing. It's white gatekeepers who are preserving the status quo one way or another. So I still work with them. You know, I work for myself, I have my own company, I create content, I still have to get it on a channel. Even if it's YouTube, like I'm doing a deal with YouTube, same shit, you know, same people on YouTube, same, when you go into a meeting, it looks the same questions you get asked. But I am doing it on my terms. So I'm not necessarily saying don't go into those places, but I would have definitely benefited from knowing what I was going into and being better prepared and understanding how it works. Because I went in thinking, these people are going to do the right thing. Because they're the Guardian. They believe in like progressive values. So yeah, the sooner I kind of disavowed myself of that illusion, the better. And of course, there are good people at all of these places, but they are institutions that are part of the system for a reason. So yeah, so just kind of see the game, I guess, and then develop a strategy and know yourself and know what you're trying to get out of it. And I think the best thing for young people of color is to know that they can go into these places knowing what they want to get out of it for them, rather than I think how many of us were raised, which is like, how can I persuade them I'm good enough to be here? It's like, go in and milk it so that you can run your own long-term vision. That is your truth. And that takes confidence. And so I couldn't have thought that way when I was at Oxford. It took me time to build the confidence and also see how this works. But if that's something I can speed up for other people, then that's what I try to do. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mu'ayyad. I like to think I'm Sudanese. I have a question, I wanted to see your take on sort of aspect of this experience that I've felt. I'm not sure if it's like quite that common, where like the only way I can figure out how to describe it is this kind of sense of survivor's guilt almost. This kind of sense of hypocrisy where, you know, I'm from Sudan and I'm here at the same time. And it's kind of weird because, you know, looking back and see like stuff that's happening in Sudan, stuff that's going wrong there, and yet, you know, like all kinds of, you know, political mismanagement and straight human rights abuses. And then here I am in a room with rich white men on the walls in Oxford, benefiting from, you know, 1,000 years of slavery and all kinds of horrible things. And it feels, I do feel guilty for it. And I'm unsure if this is sort of a justifiable sense, or if I'm sort of, I don't know, internalizing some kind of racism that I've yet to discover, or if, you know, I'm just unsure how to navigate that sense. So I'm just wondering if you've ever thought about that sense of guilt or hypocrisy in terms of, you know, being from Africa and seeing what's happening there in terms of the negativity, but also being here and benefiting from the stuff that's happening here.
Thank you for the question. I'm confident that almost everyone in this room can relate to that. I certainly can. And I was helped along by the right-wing media who frequently say, you should be so grateful. Like, how dare you? We let you in. We let you into our elite spaces. And it's the part of this kind of British racism is the idea that the best thing that can happen to us is to be allowed into elite British institutions where we can have the benefit of being more proximate to whiteness and ultimately even assimilating into whiteness. And then instead we go and ruin it all by drawing attention to how racist and problematic the legacy of these places is. And it's almost like exhibit A of the problem. You know, you're trying to say that my argument is groundless while also being the best evidence of my argument. That's how it feels. But I think that it's a really complex thing, right? And like I was saying earlier about OBEs or the bar or the media or Oxford, in a way, the only way we can advance on our mission is by going through these kind of centers of colonialism, white supremacy. That's the structure we've inherited, right? We are part of an imperial system that concentrates resources and opportunities in these places still. And then we come and navigate them. And then we have to work out how we can reconcile being in those spaces with our integrity and our authenticity as people who self-identify as African or however we self-identify. But that's, in a way, that's the process. That's the important thing, is that interrogation. There's no easy answer. And I personally hope I am working towards a world in which we don't have to get the institutional stamp of approval from Oxford to prove to the world that we are intellectually capable, for example. But ironically, the way that you do that often is to have to engage with these institutions, because we're dealing with a world where people still have a colonial mentality, you know. So I think you have to embrace that struggle. You have to embrace the paradox. You have to embrace the dilemma. You have to embrace the kind of assault to your sense of your integrity. And how I deal with these things is just by being very transparent about them. You know, instead of kind of trying to hide it, just to really be open about it. Like, yeah, it's problematic. I study in these places. You know, one thing that's how I've experienced a lot, I've been doing a lot of work to create more opportunities for Black students to come to Oxford. And it's really problematic, it's controversial. And a lot of people think that you shouldn't concentrate your effort on helping more Black people get into a space that is racist and colonial and elitist. You know, how is that part of the problem, to kind of just expand the very small pool of people who get access to elite spaces? Like, surely you should just demolish elite spaces altogether. And like, I agree in a way. I agree, but I can't, I know that I have benefited in my work and my activism by being here. So I can't in good conscience actively deprive other people from having the opportunity to be here in a way that might also further their journey. But I also acknowledge that it's a really problematic place to be. So I think you just have to kind of like embrace that as a problem. And also, if you can build a community of people who share that problem, it really helps. You keep your sanity and learn how to navigate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed listening to you. I'm from Nigeria, my background is in health. I do enjoy the fact that you said that it's people tend to think that they need to be let into certain spaces for them to be able to navigate their paths and be able to make impact. But one thing I probably would like to talk about is the fact that in the process of trying to navigate spaces, it does seem that you end up creating parallel systems. You asked a question earlier on in which you said that, do we really have decolonization in Oxford and things like that? Is the curriculum decolonized? And I was just thinking about it that, yes, to some extent, it may seem that there are changes, but even in certain places where you think that everything should be open, you sort of have a few people let in, but you still create some systems that are not integrated. You may find it interesting that there are courses that are seemingly with the same objectives, but the focus is like some are training people for low and middle income countries in Oxford. Some are training students for high income countries, even within it. So at the end of the day, if you say, is it being decolonized? Yes, they said they've given you your own maybe training system, maybe energy system, maybe health, maybe technology. But you have a situation where you want to get into spaces or you want to make impact, and you end up just having different stratas that are not really integrated. So I'm not sure if you probably have this experience or if you notice things like this, and whether you have any thoughts about them in which it may be even organization, maybe financial systems. I don't know if complain is the word, or you struggle. People struggle that they want to make impact, they want to break down barriers. You think you're making impact, but at the end of the day, you end up finding yourself within that big system in which people of color are trying to make impact. In a diversion that you probably will not even realize that that's the part you're doing, but after a while, it's just realized that it's not integrated with the mainstream.
Do you know, when as you're speaking, the example that brings to mind is the BBC. So the BBC is so white, like all of the flagship political programs. If you think about BBC Radio, for example, like Radio 4, the Today program, The World Tonight, the really prestigious like politics programs are completely white. Then they have the World Service, and then they have the languages services. You've got like Hausa service, you've got Swahili, you've got Urdu, and so it's like literally a separate floor full of Black and brown people. When the BBC publish their diversity statistics, they are all over the World Service staff. We've got so much diversity. And it's when you look at the experience of people who work for World Service, they get paid less, they have fewer benefits. It's like literally a two-tier system. It's like, here are the prestigious journalists that are on like the flagship part of the BBC, and here are the brown people we let in on less advantageous terms who are allowed to go and speak to these other brown people elsewhere in the world. It's such a colonial model. It's unbelievable. And I actually was at one point supporting a journalist who was in part of the World Service who wanted to work on the Today program. She's into politics. And it was just met with this incredulity, like, you can't work here, you're from there. It's sort of like complete segregation. And that was, even for me, I feel like I'm hard to shock. I was quite shocked at how formal the barriers are and how little mobility there is and how it's so seen as a kind of segregated thing. And I mean, it has a completely direct colonial history, obviously. It's like unreconstructed. But I think that is really common, and one way in which like quite cynical institutions are addressing the need to be more global, more diverse, is to like create separate things where they can kind of like crowd people of color, people from Africa, Asia, other continents, and leave their pristine, white, prestigious parts of the institution quite untouched. And I think we absolutely have to be very intentional about being advocates against that. It's really, really important because it's just furthering the problem, not the solution. So I think wherever there's an example of that, we need to oppose it quite vocally. So it's interesting to hear. I'd be interested to hear more about how that's happening here. And I think, it's another. These systems are designed to survive, right? They're designed to survive, and they're good at adapting. And this is one way in which they're seeking to adapt without actually changing. So it's really important to see and identify and oppose it wherever it happens. Thank you for bringing it up. It's a big issue.
I think we're gonna slowly wrap up, but I think we have one. Should we say the last question? And then
That's the last one as well.
Oh, okay.
All right. Thank you very much. It was very interesting and very lovely to be here. My name is Ruth. I'm from Tanzania. It's again very interesting that we were talking about Black British and mobilizing Black Britain. I personally have experience with like mobilizing Afro Germany, and I would like to do some research on the whole diasporic experience in how Swahili is used to verbalize Black identities in the diaspora. And my question is then whether you know of any resources that I could utilize that look at the diaspora and this verbalization of Afro identities, like collectively or like parallelly in different countries in Europe or in North America.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many. Afua springs to mind straight away. Yeah, which is like a British-based NGO that works specifically on diaspora and has been doing really interesting work, like documenting things that have never been documented before. Like they were the first, I think, to actually quantify the amount of remittances that Black people are sending back to the African continent, and they have been documenting experiences of return, even things like second and third generation remittances, for example, like do people born in Britain send money back, and how that affects their own social mobility in Britain and their property ownership and stuff like that. They do a lot of really interesting research. So it would be a good place to start. And I think if you find a good organization like that, they are connected to like European networks of other similar organizations. But that sounds really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, or maybe Azamati can round it off. So maybe we can have another first and then we hand over.
I guess mine's a little more personal, perhaps. I'm curious about how you have negotiated taking up space and having a voice, because I mean, writing a whole book requires you to have a voice and to be confident in saying things firmly. I think that's something I struggle with, even with my research, even if it's a question that I've been looking at for time. When someone asks me, my immediate response is actually don't know anything. So I guess my question is, how have you built that muscle, and what kind of advice would you give about, I guess, maybe growing or being comfortable with whatever my voice is and my truth, and just being able to speak and take up space comfortably.
Thank you for the question. I love that question. I like the way you described it as building up muscles. That's literally what it is. I haven't said anything positive about Oxford. Let me say this. Being an undergraduate here was a very painful transition into a world in which I was expected to have an opinion and voice it unapologetically. And it was actually good for me in that respect. And it was totally horrific at first because I had such imposter syndrome. And I reacted really badly to the kind of like boisterous white public school boy, just kind of like say whatever and like it's gospel because I said it, you know, and I was totally horrified by that. I didn't relate to it. I didn't respect it. And that was kind of the model of how, you know, I did PPE as well. So it's like blaggers paradise. These guys just rock up and, you know, say something outrageous as if it's literally written in stone. And so it took me time to find my own voice and find my own confidence in my ideas, but it forced me to do that. And that was ultimately really useful for me. It's just the idea that I could have a view and that this person who wrote the book would have to listen to me and engage with it. And actually I realized they're not going to laugh me out through it. And then eventually I realized, oh, my idea is actually better than this joker who's just come off rompy. You know what I mean? So it was painful at first, but that was good for me. And then I would say writing, I would never be able to just write a book. I was writing for The Guardian for like 10 years first. Actually, I started, as you mentioned, as a teenager at The Voice. And it was like just writing and seeing my thoughts in the world and realizing that people would read them and listen to them and relate to them was really important and forced me to kind of let go of this like perfectionism. Like sometimes you just have to put it out there into the world, and it's more important that you put it out there than that you kind of obsess over whether it's like the best version that it could ever be. And I think as a Black woman as well, it's like this added pressure that yours has to be perfect, masterful, literary, whatever. So again, for me, being at a newspaper is really good because you have to get that shit out by 6 p.m. It's going to print. Like you want to read over it 10 more times, run it by a few people. You can't. You have to just have confidence in what you're saying. And then also you realize again, all these colleagues of yours, they're just like, even today I write a column. When I was doing the pledge, 2 other people on the pledge wrote columns. My column, I would basically stay up all night writing it. I would read like every journal. I'd try and get hold of every book. I would interview like so many people who are experts in the field, then I'd write my column. And after the pledge, I realized like Nick Ferrari writes his column in the taxi back from the pledge in 45 minutes. Just like, that's what I think. I was like, imagine. Like you have that much audacity in just whatever, it's like you just vomited onto the page. And that's going on the front page, people will be taught. It was so interesting to me. And again, I don't aspire to be that person. I'm proud of how much research and work and thought goes into what I write. But there is something where it's like, just get it done and get it out. And why should your voice not take up space? Like it's more original and interesting and well thought out than the other people who do that all the time without a second thought. So you have to build the muscle, you do have to practice, and in a way, compared to what I do now, like getting it wrong in a tutorial room in Oxford is actually not that big a deal compared to like in the pages of The Guardian or live on CNN or, you know, so it's starting where you are and just building the muscle and getting used to your voice being out there. And also you have to let go of perfectionism. Sometimes you will get it wrong, it's not the end of the world. Other people get it wrong all the time, we can get it wrong too, it's fine. And I know it's easy to say all this, but I started from 0, honestly, and I built it up over time. And also maybe having realistic expectations, because if somebody had asked me to write a book maybe 5 years earlier, I just wouldn't have been able to do it. I did it when I was ready to do it, and it wouldn't have been helpful to have pressure to do it earlier. I had to feel ready.
Thank you. Azamati.
It's fair to say Afua could conclude on this note, to be fair. But if there are some questions on the screen, I can pass up my option, my question.
Just go ahead.
Okay, right. So for my first question is on how colonialism has been cemented in a part of your book on, I think, through origins and also in the part on abolition. You bring it up, you go like white supremacy has been cemented through Europeanization and Christianization. And I found that really intriguing. How much, to what extent will you agree or disagree with me that we are the only continent that seem to have nothing, that seem to have everything that doesn't belong to us? Take from religion is not ours. We've been told to throw ours away. Take language. We've been told that, oh, ours is not great. Actually, have the other languages. They are the ones that are great. Take economic system. Take political system. Take education. And I was smiling when you said in Ghana, people do not understand the idea of racism because we are taught to believe that one of the greatest persons on earth that has been to Ghana before is Gotjesberg, because he built the road, he built us all sorts of things. And we are taught to always think of the white person that, oh, these are the greatest people that ever stepped foot on our land. We are taught that through the Bible. And part of in fact, abolitionists at a point in time were using the Bible when slavery when they ended at abandoned slavery. There was a point where Britain was glorying in the fact that, oh yes, it took our people and they used Christianity through that, they abolished slavery, all of that. And then we are made to believe that, yes, religion was very instrumental in abandoning slavery, whereas there were parts of the Bible that were used to justify slavery and all of that. Why am I ranting? I'm just ranting because it seems to me that we are the most conflicted people ever. Because if you went to Ghana today and you told someone that you don't go to church, or you went to Nigeria or South Africa or anywhere and told people that you don't go to church, you would be crucified.
As much a lot of Africans in the room are laughing. I suspect maybe from some personal experience.
So for me, where do we draw? How do we make our own acceptable? Because it seems that we have been drenched in this. And for you to even say, to gather the courage to say that you're not a Christian, it seems like you've killed God alive.
You're trying to get me in trouble today. I promise that's not what I want to. About Christianity in African countries because, yeah. So you are obviously correct in your identification. If you talk about white supremacy, it's not a one-dimensional ideology. It created a hierarchy of races, and whilst it placed not even white people, but it placed what they described as the English Anglo-Saxon Teutonic race, all imagined constructs. At the top, it ranked other races in order of inferiority, but Africans at the bottom. So it's no surprise, I think, we as Africans have uniquely combined the worst and most toxic experiences of white supremacy. That was also by design. When it comes to Christianity, in the Americas on slave plantations, the best thing that could happen to a slave master was for his slaves to become Christian. In a way, that's all you need to know. It was such a powerful tool of distraction from the reality of how poisonous whiteness was as a force in their life. It was a way of controlling people. It was a way of cementing absolutely deeply into their psyche and their spirituality this idea that whiteness was a saving force. And it is what it is, and I personally struggle with the idea that you can really mentally decolonize whilst also embracing a religion that is based on European supremacy. And that's not to say that there isn't a lot of spiritual wisdom in Christianity. And so, I think maybe it's useful to separate the spirituality of Christianity and all the great faiths from the institutions. And in the case of Christianity, the institutions are, it's not controversial to say, part and parcel of the slavery and colonial infrastructure. They literally own slaves. The people who came to West Africa were colonial administrators, slave traders, and missionaries. So they worked together to oppress and turn the continent into a resource base. So that is what it is. And again, I don't tell people what to believe or what faith to have, and I really deeply respect people's faith. But what I miss is the presence of an interrogation of that history. I would like people to be introspective about what it is they are subscribing to, what mental programming they are embracing, and that is what's missing. Because if you go through that process and you still decide this is your faith and these are your beliefs, no one can challenge that. It's so deeply personal, but the problem is that you just don't even hear the conversation. So and it's just repeating itself, because now we see in West African countries is that this new generation of American imperialism, these American white evangelists are now taking over Christianity. They're taking over churches. They are the ones people go and pay to see in all-night prayer reigns. And this, if you look at who these people are and what they believe, it should be quite clear that they are not about uplifting Black people. They are not about the decolonization of the African continent. There is nothing in their background or institutions or financial arrangements that could make anyone deluded that they are about Black people. But yet we still support them and turn out for them. And so it's just that critique that I think is really missing. And for me, that's just an example of how successful colonialism has been. You know, it really worked. And Britain talks about Ghana as its model colony. And the reason for that is that Ghanaians, you know, it worked in Ghana. It really, really worked. I think according to Britain, it worked there better than anywhere else on the African continent. And that I don't think is something we should be proud of. I think it should be a rallying call to make sure that we don't continue being their model colony.
On that note, I think, thank you so much. Thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing your words and your wisdom. Yeah, for gracing us and England and everywhere with your presence and what you're doing. I really deeply, from the bottom of my heart, think it's so important. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. You've been an amazing audience. It's been lovely to be with you. Thank you for the great questions.
And thank you, Adam.
Thank you very much to Hope for accepting to be a discussant, Nana. And Nana is an author. Her book is out on the bookshelves in all bookstores. It's called The Godchild, published by Penguin in Germany. And she would be in the hot seat next time when the Africa Society Reading Corner would be scheduled for next term, and we shall surely let you know the date. And as I said, Afua will be back in a grand style at a different time.
He said that with confidence because he knows he's a difficult man to say no.
And thank you to all the audience, both online and in person. We very much appreciate it. Next time, we promise it's going to be a bigger venue so that everyone can have somewhere. But if you have Afua's book around with you now, I can crave her indulgence for the next 5 to 10 minutes. I hope she grants me that audience.
Yeah, that's fine.
And you could come by for her to
in
sign.
About 20 minutes,
okay,
but
great.
I am here for anything until then.
Great. So you can come by for her to sign your autograph for her, because the next time you might hear her, she will be a president of a country somewhere. So thank you everybody for coming. We very much appreciate it.
Lots of drinks and snacks. Please help yourself as you mingle
I'm going to run to the loo
and
before I do
chat
anything
with
else.